Hi everyone, Teddy Baldassarre here. So with 2021 coming to a close, I wanted to do one kind of final year Q&A, answering some of your questions, reacting to some of your comments and just perspectives on the industry. So we have about 10 to 15 or so different questions and things of that sort that I'm gonna be going through today and kind of just wrapping up the year in a somewhat positive note. I actually don't know all these questions, so some of them might not be as positive, but just to have a little bit of fun as we kind of conclude the holiday season. And on that tune of the holiday season, if you are still in the market, even though we're kind of, maybe past the time of buying gifts, if you're still looking to maybe add a watch to your collection or to somebody else's and want to give a late year or a late gift surprise to somebody, check out our latest guide looking at some different watches available on teddybaldassarre.com. The whole team put together some of their top picks at a variety of different price ranges. Still a good thing to look at if you are looking for your next watch. Definitely check it out. Link will be in the description down below. Now our first question comes from Mike, and his question is Hublot really as bad as Nico says it is? So I know Nico talks a lot about Hublot and it's become kind of like a growing meme. Now, two things when talking about Hublot. In my part of the world, in the United States, they don't have as much of a footprint as other places like Europe. I know that they're a sponsor and they have a lot of like brand affiliations with a lot of like football players in the EPL. So I think there's a bit of a different type of perspective, at least in the United States versus what's going on overseas. I don't think that Hublot makes a bad watch. I think the reason why they get hate is really coming down to some of their designs are almost the epitome of buying a luxury product without any essence of taste in some ways. Some people might say that. They're a little bit more gaudy, a little bit more out there, and they're just kind of usually larger on the wrist. They kind of were a brand that rose from like the mid 2000s to the 2010s, and they're still kind of working off that same type of design style that worked in that period. But if you're talking about it from a watchmaking perspective, I don't think you can necessarily put down what's happening there. It's more of just the design and the positioning of the brand that I think leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Like for me personally, I think the Classic Fusion is a nice design. Some of their stuff with the Big Bang is just too much for me, so I get the pushback. I don't think they're necessarily as bad as some people say, but I totally understand why people kind of use them as a punching bag in certain instances. So our next question states, what is the best in-house under 3K? Speaking about in-house movements, I do want to reference the video that I posted last month talking about the concept of in-house movements, because that was a good way of just dissecting the industry and what's going on with the language around in-house, because in a lot of ways, it is kind of some jargon and semantics that are just really being attached to that word or concept. But to speak to what I would classify as the best in-house movement, and it really depends on how you're going to qualify it and really what you look for. If you're looking for just sheer performance, extended power reserve, that might bring you in another area. But if you're talking about actual finishing and just what presents more of a luxury experience with just the look of it, under 3K if we're talking retail, pre-owned is going to open it up to a lot more possibilities. But just to kind of give us a ability just to focus, I would look at Nomos. And I think the DUW 3001 is one of the better finish, just watch movements you're going to find in that price. I think it's providing better than what a lot of brands are just slightly above. In terms of a finishing and looks perspective, I think that movement, those DUW movements are going to be some of the best finish for the money, no doubt about it. You can find them in the Club Neomatics and some of the Ahoy Neomatics that are right in that range, but I think you can get those for right around $3,000 retail. And those are impressive movements to look at. They are machine finished. They do have their swing system escapement, so proprietary escapement on these, and Nomos and what they've been able to develop from vertical integration of developing in-house movements is rather impressive for a company that's been around for 30 or so years. The next question asks here, why is VC not as talked about as Patek or AP? So I'm a huge lover of Vacheron Constantin, and in terms of their history, it's unmatched, really hard to beat going back to 1755. The designs that they go for are just, it's classic, and I would say have epitomized class more than almost any other brand out there. They are really cream of the crop. But if you look at what they are just known for from a mass market perspective compared to Patek or AP, you do have a point. They're not talked about as much. And I think that's for two reasons. One, if you look at what is talked about the most in modern watchmaking, it's the steel sports and some other just really sought after commission pieces, maybe going in auction houses. But if I look at Patek and AP, I think of Nautilus Aquanaut, I think of Royal Oak Offshore. And although I love the overseas, it just hasn't caught on the same way as those watches. So I think that's number one. Their appeal is a little bit more to the dress side of things, and that is just not what's popular right now. But then number two is it's just also about just brand structure. VC is operated by the Richemont Group, and when you're operated with a large group structure, you're not going to have the same level of autonomy in terms of your production, how you're going to position the brand, and maybe what models you create. That's going to have an effect. And when you lose autonomy as a luxury brand, that is gonna sometimes make you struggle with gaining market position in certain ways. So I think those are the two reasons why. Is that necessarily something that I would say is right, or something that I would say I would prefer to have people look at just Patek and AP always over VC? Absolutely not. I think Vacheron makes a product that's just in alignment. That considered though, I would put VC in terms of like the Swiss Trinity, I mean, still right there. And I believe more people need to wise up and just look in VC's direction a bit more as time goes on, because as Patek and AP, not as like an alternative to these brands, but just as a brand that has its own history, its own unique designs, and I think a lot to offer when you're talking about this segment of watchmaking. So Bobby asked next, Teddy, if you could take the helm of any major watch brand with the full power to continue the course or change directions, which would you choose and why? How would you hope to see that brand look in 10 to 20 years time? So I'll give you two answers. If I'm just talking about a mass market perspective, I'd look at a brand like Omega or Tudor. I like that range of $3,000 to $10,000. And I think as a brand or a leader of that brand, say like your CEO, you could dictate a lot of change and also be that kind of first luxury watch. And I would say what really dictates taste in a lot of ways, outside of maybe some of those like the Royal Oaks of the world or the Patek Nautiluses, it's that price range is being, I would say, the most impactful for curating a lot of the taste as you move upward. And you also have a lot of control in kind of creating some cultural relevance around watches, because that's where I would say most people are ready to spend their luxury dollars, and I like the archives of both of those brands. But then going on the other side, looking at kind of a totally different perspective and what I think would actually, you could administer the most change, or there's probably the most potential, I would look more to the high horology tier, something with limited production, and aren't one of the main players, or maybe aren't seen in the same realm as some of the Swiss Trinity, but have the potential to be, maybe something like a Lange, where their production's around 5,000 with some subtle changes. I think you should focus on really what the brand excels at, maybe trim down some of the Saxonia lines and focus on some of the more complicated datograph up-downs, perpetuals, minute repeaters, Zeitwerk minute repeaters, things like that really can allow the brand to excel. And what I would say is their number one attribute, which is their finishing for the money. They're absolutely fantastic. Lange, in terms of finishing perspective, is good as any independent brand, but they're still within a group structure. So I just feel like that's one of those things that, very similar to what I mentioned about Vacheron, if you change how you operate brands within a group structure to be more operated as an independent and have some autonomy, I think that is so good for the longevity of the brand and keeping pricing integrity. And then the other one that interests me is like a Breguet, but for different reasons. I just think Breguet nowadays is such a shell of what it was in the past. Like this, in terms of history, Breguet is right near the top of being one of the most impactful watch brands of all time in terms of development. But the truth is, this is something I talk about, I think there's other brands in the independent world that make a better Breguet watch than Breguet themselves. Breguet still has some amazing pieces to look at, but I think there's a lot to reimagine with that collection. The same way in terms of operations, slimming down production, really focusing on the basics, looking back at the archive and where are some notable instances and points in our history that we can really focus and reimagine our collection with. I would love to just go deep into that and just have some fun. They're of course well-known brands, but in terms of potential, I think there's a lot in front of them. Our next question here, Matt is asking, are there any independent watchmakers that us ordinary folk could aspire to? So I'm not sure what kind of classifies ordinary, because there's nothing ordinary about collecting watches, to be honest with you. But I'll kind of give a few different takes. Now, micro brands versus independents is a game of semantics a little bit, but things that I would classify as like an independent versus a micro brand. A micro brand is a little bit less established. You don't have a master watchmaker at the helm. You're maybe not making as many components, more positioned towards the lower end, but still some compelling watches, and you could make cases for certain micros are kind of in that world of independence depending on what they do. A couple brands that I would recommend that are kind of right on the fringe there would be like that really nice up tier of like $2,000. You can start getting into some really cool brands that are just different. Maybe looking at something like a Anordain, which I'm huge on. I just love their enamel dials. You could look at the likes of a Formex, a Ferrer, as well as like a Monta. Those brands I think deliver a pretty compelling package and are a nice tier up from a lot of the stuff that you're gonna find under $1,000. But if we're talking about like true independence, I would look at something like Habring too, to have a master watchmaker like Richard Habring making those watches and prices under $10,000. I mean, that's, I think, some of the best value you're gonna find. Louis Erard is also getting a lot of buzz as of late, kind of similar price range for a lot of their pieces, depending on the movement. You can look at Ming, which of course got a lot of buzz in the last few years. And then RGM, a lot of their stuff that they're doing with their own in-house calibers are going to be more expensive, but I think those are all good watches to maybe aspire to own. Independents have really interested me increasingly more as I've just gotten more into watches and have progressed in just my journey. So a lot to get lost in, and I would definitely just continue to do some research. There's some really good under the kind of cover brands in the world of watchmaking. For our next question we have, as a beginner, what is a good finish exactly? So I have a video looking at what I think it's what makes a good quality watch, or I think it's like how to tell if a watch is well made, something of that sort. And I just kind of go on a tangent and say things that I notice, but I'll kind of break it up in a few parts. I would say anything under like $5,000, the biggest separation that you are going to find when it comes to finishing. Movements are going to dictate price pretty much more than anything else, but finishing of the case and things that I would look for, like facets on the case, really stark changes in direction, finishing technique. So does it really have clean brush strokes? If it's a brushing, does it combine polishing and brushing, both on the bracelet edges, the lugs, looking at the bracelet? Those are going to be key indicators of just showing that they're going the extra mile. If you have more of these rounded off sides, that's not necessarily, I mean, because it's a look in itself, but sometimes that can be an exercise of trying to cut costs if it's not something chosen for the aesthetic. And you look at this for some really attainable watches, there's really no just kind of stark beveling or anything of that sort. So that's where I would look at from the case perspective. Bracelet, those are the easiest things to notice. Also, when dealing with dials, you can look at different techniques like enameling. That's of course going to be usually an elevated technique. Applied markers, whether printed versus applied, that's also going to have an effect. Is there faceting on the actual markers themselves or the hands? How are those finished? If you have individual components like that that are going to have either brushing or polishing on those elements, that's a nice way or just an indicator of better attention to detail with finishing as a priority. But under this $5,000 tier, because you're dealing with mostly embossed movements, the movements are not going to really be an indicator of finish the same way as a case, bracelet, or dial will be, just given that you're so confined to what an embossed movement's going to provide you, or a third-party movement. Usually those are coming fully cased up, so individual components can't really be finished unless they're going to disassemble, but for those price ranges, just doesn't really make that much sense. But then you start getting up to the $5,000 price range, and this is where I start to see things change quite a bit. You start to see some elevated detail with individual components getting finished more, heat-treated hands. You're getting also some up bracelet. That's really where I see a lot of strides being made, is once you get to like the $5,000 price range, most brands out there are going to really deliver a better quality bracelet. Machine finishing on the movement components, but some of that stuff is also actually just being done at the individual component level, like bridges and things of that sort. And then when you get above like $10,000 into $20,000, it's really where the movement finishing is, I find, the biggest jump up. This is all diminishing returns, to say the least. As you go up in price, the changes to the finishing and technique are going to just be very, very nominal in comparison to maybe what you might pay. But the movement, I would say, is really the area that you're gonna notice the most. Individual finishing on bridges, components, base plate, things like even the underside of a main plate being finished, even though a watchmaker is gonna be the only person that's going to see it. Different points of assembly with the balance and things of that sort. Hand engraving on a balance cock, you're going to see different like uses of materials like gold and having, say, like a Côte de Genève finish, perlage finish. different graining techniques, all of those elements together, and also seeing it done on an individual level, an individual component level, is really what's happening as you start moving up in the world of finishing. I have a whole video on this. I know I probably already went through a lot of the points on that video, but I would recommend it because that's a much longer one and I go into a bit more detail. Next question is, aside from watches, do you have any other burning interests? So I am all over the board in terms of my interests. I think a lot of people just expect me to be interested in watches, and that's what I do all day long. I do cover watches and handle watches all day. I mean, it's a big part of what I do, but I'm interested in a lot of different things. I'm a huge sports fan. I grew up being very interested in sports. So basketball, football, and by football, I mean American football. Probably two of my favorite things. I'm a huge MMA fan as well. So those are things that just kind of my leisure time that I enjoy doing. Music was also a big part of my life growing up and still is to this day. My dad's a composer, so music was just a big part of our household. I played drums. If I picked up some sticks today and started playing on a kit, it would be rough, but that was still a huge part of my upbringing, and I have just a variety of interests in different genres there. That was something that is still even a big part of my day-to-day life. Photography, watches I think are some of the most fun things to shoot, but just photography in general, cameras, it's just something that interests me. When it comes to other things that either you collect or just level of interest in just finely made goods, I'm a big fragrance lover, so that's something that I also collect. Ever since I went to Florist in London on Jermyn Street and got a sample of fine fragrances, that was something that really, I don't know, it just kind of allowed the same way I got into watches. Like, it's a point of individual expression that's unique to you, what you wear on your wrist, what you smell like. I just got gravitated towards that, and that was just a point of interest for me. So that's something I really love, and something I also share with Courtney, which I think is really important. Also heritage clothing, if we're talking about salvage denim, Goodyear welted boots, all things in that world I also really like and are interested in, but I'm really all over the map, and I like to stay curious. I think that's one of my more important traits about myself and just in people in general. I think curiosity and interest, I think, allow people to eventually become interesting. For our next question, it's all about gifting a watch. What are the essentials to know for shopping for a gift watch or a watch enthusiast or someone new to watches? Wrist size, use, dial, etc. I understand a lot of this is preference of the recipient and budget limited, but having a checklist of considerations or questions to ask them would be helpful. Now, first thing I will say is don't force watches on somebody that is just never going to be interested in them. Kind of tease at it first, get a real sense of whether or not they're gonna actually wear it. Nobody likes the guy or person that's giving things away that they're interested in that nobody else is interested in. If you're calculated with maybe how you present the idea of a watch and they're starting to show interest, I think you just gotta let it progress naturally. So that would be my first point of just recommendation, just because I think a lot of people just force on their interest to the other people around them, which actually makes them hate the very thing you're interested in even more. But if you do have somebody that's generally interested in watches, or maybe is open to the idea, you've maybe had a discussion with them, you think it'd be a nice gift, I would just ask a question and really get an idea of what they like, or just kind of in passing, like if you wanna be more subtle about it, like, hey, what do you think of this watch? What do you think of that watch? Like, that's what I did with Courtney, for example. Like, I just would show her watches all the time and she would tell me her take, some not so good, some good. And I would just kind of use that as gathering of information so that I can make a good assessment of what they're styling and what they liked. But I think it's actually important to not just go at and just buy something randomly without getting some input. This isn't just like a really cheap stocking stuffer, unless you're talking about something under $100 or so with like a G-Shock, for example, and they're just gonna have fun with it. If you're talking about a watch, even from a more attainable watch perspective, that's still a lot of money compared to the vast majority of gifts that you might be giving someone during the holiday season. I think wrist size, dial, don't overcomplicate it. People don't really, when they aren't into it, are not gonna understand what they like, what they don't like. They're just gonna say, hey, I like the way that looks, and it's as simple as that. If you have an enthusiast, you can gather cues about what they have in their collection, and that could be a great indicator, but just be subtle about it, gather your information and make an informed decision. But I would never go in blind, or really try to get their input before moving forward and making a purchase. So our last question here comes from JLB Watches. What percentage of your revenue is from YouTube versus your online store? Now, there's a lot of just uncertainty when it comes to like YouTube and just how all of this works. How you set up your business in YouTube is very different for different channels out there. I am in the small niche world of watches. And when that's the case, even though we reach about 3.5, 4 million viewers a month, which is crazy for the category that we're in. Honestly, I feel so blessed to be able to do what I do on a day-to-day basis. But to answer your question, YouTube as an outlet in terms of revenue there compared to the store, it's not even close. 90% or more is coming from the store, and that's really what makes all of actually the content possible. Ever since we launched the store, we were able to hire way more people to support the content. Say 18 months ago, just look at the content, or 3 years ago, look at the content that we were posting versus now. We've just made leaps, and just the amount that's going out. I mean, we have people that are helping me out when it comes to shooting, editing, and just things that I would just never be able to do. We have a staff of full 10 people now, which has been incredible to see the growth. And we're a pretty lean operation in terms of how we operate from a video perspective, posting 3 videos a week on our main channel, and then an additional 3 to 4 on our review channel. So we're a pretty well-oiled machine. It didn't happen overnight, but really all how that's been made possible is through the online store. And to make a video on this channel, I mean, you're talking about 4 figures for every video that we make, and it's going to change depending on complexity. If you're talking about going somewhere and traveling, compared to something like a video here, it's much different. Different camera operators, average editing time is probably between 30 hours to 40 hours on average. But if you're talking about something really complicated, like that limited supply video that I did, or talking about the market dynamics of why people can't buy a Rolex or Patek right now, like a video like that is hundreds of hours to make when you're talking about everybody's time put together. Talking about my time with just how much time I put in that script, the animations and the edit. I mean, there's probably over 100 hours just in the editing of that video. And people are doing that. So it costs a lot of money to make the content that we're making. And really the only way that is possible is through the online store. But all right, guys, that is the Q&A for today. I wanna thank all of you for watching, submitting questions, and just making 2021 probably the best year of my life so far. So I really do appreciate if you watch, if you've bought a watch on TeddyBaldassarre.com, all of that is just so great in supporting what we're doing here. I love what I get to do on a day-to-day basis. I'm having a blast. I had no idea where this ride when I started it was gonna take me. And I just wanna thank you all for just the support. And I hope the content that we make here is just engaging and you find entertainment out of it, because we have a lot of fun putting it together. And it really means the world to me that you guys all watch and enjoy it. But guys, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Also, be sure to check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of over 30 brands. Also a new pre-owned section as well, so definitely head over there and check it out. If you wanna stay up to date with the content, Instagram is a great place to do it as well. And you see some great photos of watches in the process. But all right, guys, thank you again so much for watching. Happy holidays. Be well, and I'll see you all very soon.